152 years of silence. That is how long Black Diamond Pool inside Yellowstone National Park sat quietly bubbling before, in 2024, it suddenly exploded. And then in late April of this year, it exploded twice more, in less than 24 hours, and the second blast was larger than the first. 6 days later, on the other side of the country, Kīlauea fired episode 46 of its ongoing eruption, a 650-foot tower of molten rock erupting for 9 straight hours. Both of these events come from the same kind of deep earth engine. What exactly is happening beneath America right now? Stick around, because what these two systems are hiding is something genuinely unsettling. If this already has you asking questions, hit like and subscribe to the Skylab, because this story is nowhere near finished. One pool has already detonated twice. One volcano is still cycling on an 11-day clock. The pressure is still loading in places we cannot directly see, and somewhere between the official language of routine monitoring and a sequence of events with no clean modern precedent, there is a gap that somebody needs to keep filling in. That is what we do here. You're going to want to be here when the next one breaks. Now let us get into it. Part 1. The Overlooked Coincidence. In a single week, the two most powerful volcanic engines buried beneath the United States both decided to speak. Not whisper, not stir, speak. And almost nobody noticed they were speaking at the same time. On May 5th, 2026, the summit of Kīlauea launched a column of molten rock 650 feet into the Hawaiian sky. That is taller than a 60-story building made entirely of liquid fire. The eruption lasted 9 hours. It pushed an ash plume 20,000 feet into the atmosphere, high enough to interfere with commercial aviation, high enough that pilots flying between the West Coast and the Pacific had to reroute. By the time the fountain finally died back into the crater, 6 million cubic yards of fresh basalt had been ejected from the throat of the volcano. To put that in perspective, that is enough molten rock to fill the Empire State Building from foundation to spire roughly 5 times over in 9 hours. Now hold that image in your mind, the orange tower of fire screaming out of the Pacific. Because while that was happening, on the other side of the country, beneath a quiet pine forest in northwestern Wyoming, something far stranger was unfolding. Something almost nobody on cable news bothered to explain properly. Just days earlier, on April the 28th and 29th, a thermal feature called Black Diamond Pool inside Yellowstone National Park did something it had not done in 152 years. It exploded. And then less than 24 hours later, it exploded again. The second blast was larger than the first. Boulders bigger than baseballs were hurled across the rim of the pool. Steam shot dozens of feet into the air. Trees were knocked down. The boardwalks that tourists had been walking on the previous summer sat just feet from the impact zone. These two events look nothing alike on the surface. One is fire, the other is steam. One is a glowing river of melted stone climbing toward the clouds. The other is a violent burst of superheated water reorganizing the ground around a pool of mineral-rich liquid. One is a spectacle you can see from a helicopter 20 miles away. The other is the kind of event that, if you happen to be standing in the wrong place, you would never see coming. But here is the part that the headlines missed. Both of those events, the lava fountain and the steam explosion, are surface expressions of the same kind of phenomenon. They are both powered by what geologists call a mantle plume. A mantle plume is a narrow column of abnormally hot rock that rises from somewhere very deep inside the Earth, possibly all the way down at the boundary between the molten outer core and the solid mantle. That boundary sits roughly 1,800 miles beneath your feet. These plumes punch through the rigid tectonic plates that make up the surface of our planet, and where they break through, they create hotspots. Not volcanoes at the edges of plates, where most volcanism happens, but volcanoes in the middle of plates. Strange, anomalous, persistent. There are only a handful of these confirmed mantle plumes on the entire planet. Iceland has one, Reunion has one, La Palma sits over one, and the United States, alone among the nations of the world, has 2 of them on its sovereign soil, 2 of these rare, deep, terrifying engines. And in the first week of May 2026, both of them sent up a signal at almost exactly the same time. Now, if you're anything like me, the moment you hear something like that, your brain immediately starts looking for a connection. Because that is what human brains do. We are pattern seekers. We see 2 unusual events happening close together in time, and we want to know if one is causing the other. We want to know if there is a hidden hand, a deeper rhythm, a synchronization beneath the noise. It feels meaningful. It feels like a message. And here is where I have to stop you. Because the truth is messier than the pattern, and in some ways, more interesting than the pattern. These two systems, despite being powered by similar deep Earth phenomena, are not directly connected. They are thousands of miles apart. They sit on different tectonic plates. They have different chemistry, different plumbing, different histories. The same week, the same cause, but the same week meaningless either. Because while the connection is not what people are claiming online, there is a real story buried inside this coincidence. A story about how one of these systems is behaving exactly the way scientists expect it to, and the other one is doing something nobody can fully explain. A story about why we keep getting reminded that we live on a planet whose interior we have barely begun to map. So why did both of these systems decide to remind us, in the same news cycle, that they are still very much awake? Stay with me. Because this is not a disaster story, this is an understanding gap story, and the most disturbing part of it is not what is happening, it is what we cannot yet explain. Part 2. The timing problem. Let me lay out the timeline as cleanly as I can, because the order of events matters more than the speed of the headlines. On April 28th, 2026, sometime in the late afternoon, Black Diamond Pool inside the Biscuit Basin thermal area of Yellowstone produced its first hydrothermal explosion of the week. Park geologists were on site within hours. They documented the ejected debris, mapped the damage radius, took thermal readings of the surrounding ground. The pool itself had been altered. The geometry of the bottom had changed. The chemistry of the water shifted. By the standards of Yellowstone monitoring, this was a significant event, but not unprecedented. The pool had also exploded in 2024, so while it was alarming, it fit a pattern that had only just begun to form. Then, less than 24 hours later, on April 29th, the same pool exploded again, and this second blast was larger than the first. That is the detail that has scientists genuinely puzzled, and we will come back to that later in detail. For now, just hold on to the fact that two explosions happened back to back, and the second one was bigger. 6 days after that, on May 5th, Kīlauea opened up episode 46, 650 feet of fountaining, 20,000-foot plume, 9 hours of sustained activity, the summit of one of the most monitored volcanoes on Earth doing what it has been doing, off and on, for the last 17 months. Now zoom out, because while those two American systems were releasing energy, the global seismic record was also unusually active in the same window. On the same day Kīlauea fountained, a magnitude 5.8 earthquake struck along the Aleutian Arc off the coast of Alaska. That quake was significant enough to trigger a tsunami advisory for parts of the Aleutian island chain, an alert that was eventually downgraded but which kept emergency responders on edge for hours. Around the same time, the Philippines registered a magnitude 5.5. The Kermadec subduction zone, north of New Zealand, recorded a magnitude 5.6. None of these are catastrophic earthquakes on their own. The Earth produces magnitude 5 quakes almost every day. But the clustering of multiple notable events along the Pacific Rim, in the same window as two American hotspot events, is the kind of thing that lights up online forums and conspiracy threads. So is something synchronizing all of this? Is the Pacific Ring of Fire pulsing in some coordinated way? Or is your brain just doing what your brain always does when it sees several unusual things stacked up next to each other in time? Here is the truth. Independent systems can absolutely line up by chance. Statisticians have a name for this. They call it the clustering illusion. If you flip a fair coin 1,000 times, you will see streaks of 10 heads in a row, and those streaks feel meaningful, but they are not. They are exactly what randomness looks like when you stare at it long enough. The same thing applies to seismic and volcanic activity on a planetary scale. The Earth is a noisy, energetic system. Things happen all the time. When 2 or 3 of those things happen close together, our pattern-seeking minds light up and say, this must mean something. And yet, even knowing all of that, even understanding the clustering illusion intellectually, the question still gnaws at you, doesn't it? Could there be a deeper synchronization that we just do not have the instruments to detect yet? Mantle convection cycles operate on timescales of millions of years, but they involve the movement of enormous amounts of material and energy through the interior of the Earth. We do not have a complete model of how those flows interact with each other. We do not know whether subtle pressure waves can travel through the mantle in ways that affect distant systems simultaneously. We do not know what we do not know. This is the central tension of our story, and it is going to come back at the end. We have two hotspots on American soil, both reminding us in the same week that they are alive. The mainstream explanation says coincidence, the fringe explanation says synchronization, and the honest answer, the answer scientists actually give when you press them, sits somewhere in between, in a fog of uncertainty about how the deep Earth really moves. We will get to the question of solar weather, of space, of the sun's role in all of this later. Because there is a separate, fringier hypothesis that says something even stranger is going on, and we're going to pull at that thread before this story's over. But for now, hold on to the timeline. Two American hotspots, both active, a global seismic backdrop that is busier than usual, and a public conversation that is asking the wrong questions about all of it. What is really happening beneath America right now? And why does the answer depend on which mountain you are looking at? Part 3. What the headlines got wrong. If you opened almost any news app in the first week of May, you saw two very different framings of these two events, and both framings were misleading in opposite directions. Yellowstone got the doomsday treatment. The supervolcano is waking up. The next eruption could end civilization. Scientists are concerned. You know the rhythm. Anytime anything happens at Yellowstone, a certain kind of headline writer reaches for the same script. Because Yellowstone is the boogeyman of American geology. It is the system everyone has been told to fear since they were children watching disaster documentaries. So when Black Diamond Pool exploded twice, the framing wrote itself. The supervolcano is stirring. Run. Kīlauea, meanwhile, got the opposite treatment. The story barely made it onto national news. When it did, it was framed as a routine eruption. Just another fountain. Hawaiians are used to it. Tourists came out to take pictures. Nothing to see here, move along. And here is what is wild about that. Both of those framings are wrong. They are inverted. They have the danger profile flipped backwards. Let me explain. What happened at Kīlauea on May 5th was, in the strictest sense of the word, normal. It was the system doing exactly what the system has been doing for nearly a year and a half. It was episode 46 in a sequence of 46. The behaviour was within expected parameters. Geologists who study Kīlauea were not surprised. They were not concerned about anything anomalous. They were, if anything, taking notes on what is becoming a remarkably consistent cycle. Hawaii's hotspot is functioning the way Hawaii's hotspot functions. The system is working. What happened at Yellowstone, on the other hand, is not normal. And I do not mean that in the apocalyptic supervolcano awakening sense. The mainstream coverage actually got that part right. There is no evidence of magma moving toward the surface. The deep magma chamber beneath Yellowstone is not showing signs of pressurization. The ground is not deforming. The seismic networks are not picking up the kinds of harmonic tremors that precede major eruptions. So the supervolcano framing is wrong. There is no global threat unfolding here, you can sleep tonight. But the routine event framing is also wrong, because what happened at Black Diamond Pool was not routine. It was the second time in 2 years that a feature which had been quiet for over a century and a half had violently erupted, and this time it erupted twice in 24 hours, with the second blast larger than the first. That pattern, that escalation, that local change in the system is not what headline writers should be ignoring just because the deep magma is quiet. So you have to separate two different kinds of dangerous. There is the global, civilization-ending kind of dangerous, the kind that requires magma movement and a full caldera eruption. That is not what is happening at Yellowstone. And then there is the local, immediate, lethal kind of dangerous, the kind where you happen to be standing on a boardwalk in the wrong place at the wrong moment when a hydrothermal explosion shoots boulders into the air. That is absolutely what is happening at Yellowstone, and it appears to be becoming more frequent. This is the difference between a magmatic event and a hydrothermal event. A magmatic event involves molten rock. A hydrothermal event involves water. Specifically, it involves water that has been superheated under pressure and then suddenly released, expanding violently as it converts to steam. Hydrothermal explosions are not powered by magma reaching the surface. They are powered by water flashing to vapour faster than the surrounding rock can accommodate, and when that happens, the consequences are entirely local. They do not threaten the planet, they do not even threaten the region, but they absolutely threaten anyone who happens to be standing within a few hundred feet of the explosion. So here is the inversion. Hawaii, the loud spectacle, is the system you understand. Yellowstone, the quiet anomaly, is the system you do not. The thing that should be making you uneasy is not the fountain of fire. It is the pool of water that exploded twice when it should have only exploded once. The real story is being overlooked because it does not fit the dramatic narrative the public has been trained to expect. The quiet anomaly matters more than the loud eruption, and to understand why, we need to look at what these two systems have in common deep down. Because despite their wildly different surface behaviour, they are running on the same kind of engine. Part 4. Two systems, one origin. So let us go down, way down, past the boardwalks and the lava fountains, past the surface rocks, past the crust, past the upper mantle. We are heading for the source. The source, in both cases, is what geophysicists call a mantle plume. And mantle plumes are weird. Most of the volcanism on Earth happens at plate boundaries, where one tectonic plate dives under another, or where two plates pull apart. The Pacific Ring of Fire, that famous arc of volcanoes circling the Pacific Ocean, is almost entirely plate boundary volcanism. The Andes, the Cascades, Indonesia, Japan, all of them sit at the edges of plates, where the geometry of plate motion creates predictable conditions for melting. Mantle plumes do not care about any of that. A mantle plume is a column of hot rock that rises through the mantle from somewhere very deep, and when it hits the underside of a tectonic plate, it can punch a hole through the plate from below. It does not need a plate boundary. It does not care where the plate is. It just rises, and where it rises, it creates volcanism. This is why Hawaii sits in the middle of the Pacific Plate, thousands of miles from any boundary, and yet has some of the most active volcanism on the planet. The plate is moving. The plume is staying put. The plume is punching through. Now here is where the two American plumes start to look very different despite their shared origin. The Hawaiian plume sits under oceanic crust. Oceanic crust is thin, dense, and mostly basaltic. When the Hawaiian plume melts the rock above it, the magma that gets produced is also basaltic. Basaltic magma has low silica content, which means it is relatively fluid. It flows, it fountains, it moves like a thick syrup rather than a sticky paste. That is why Kīlauea produces those iconic rivers of red lava that you have seen in every Hawaii volcano video ever made. The chemistry of the magma allows it to flow. The Yellowstone plume, on the other hand, sits under continental crust. North American continental crust is much thicker, much older, and chemically very different from oceanic crust. It is full of silicates, full of granites, full of the kind of light, complex rocks that make up the bulk of the continents. When the Yellowstone plume rises up and tries to melt the rock above it, the resulting magma absorbs all of that silica-rich crust. So the magma at Yellowstone is rhyolitic. It is high silica, viscous, sticky, gas-rich. When it erupts, it does not flow, it explodes. The chemistry of the magma forces the system into violent eruptions rather than gentle fountains. But the engine is the same in both cases, a column of hot rock rising from depth, possibly from very, very far down. Some seismic studies have suggested that the Hawaiian plume reaches all the way down to the core mantle boundary, almost 2,900 kilometers below the surface. That is roughly the depth at which the solid mantle meets the liquid outer core. If that is correct, the rock that fountains out of Kīlauea today began its journey upward from a depth where iron is molten and pressures are unimaginable. The Yellowstone plume's depth is more debated, but recent studies have pushed it deeper than was previously thought, with strong evidence that it also originates well below the upper mantle. These plumes are also old. The Hawaiian hotspot has been active for at least 80 million years. We know this because the Pacific Plate has been moving over the hotspot the entire time, and as it moves, the volcanoes built by the plume get carried away from the source. Each old volcano then gets replaced by a new one. The result is a chain of seamounts and islands stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific, marking the path the plate has taken across a stationary heat source. That chain is called the Hawaiian Emperor Seamount Chain, and we will come back to it. The Yellowstone hotspot has a similar track record. As the North American plate has slid westward over the Yellowstone plume, it has left behind a trail of ancient calderas across what is now Idaho and Oregon. The Snake River Plain, that broad volcanic plain you see on a map, is essentially the path the continent has taken across the plume. So here is the question that this raises, and it is a question that does not get asked often enough. Why do two systems running on essentially the same kind of engine produce such radically different surface behaviour? Same heat source from below, wildly different output above. The answer is the rock above the plume. The crust shapes the eruption. But that answer also tells you something important about how much we cannot see. Because if the surface expression depends so heavily on the local geometry, then the relationship between the deep engine and the surface event is not direct. It is filtered, it is mediated, it is messy. And that mess is exactly where the Yellowstone anomaly is hiding right now. Because the deep engine at Yellowstone is doing nothing unusual. The surface is. So whatever changed, it changed somewhere in between, somewhere in the filter. And we are going to come back to that puzzle. But first, we need to understand the system that is behaving so we can compare it to the system that is not. Part 5. The real hook. Let me reframe what we're doing here, because I want to make sure you're with me before we go deeper. This is not a story about coincidence. It is also not a story about connection. The two events of the first week of May 2026 were not synchronized by some hidden mechanism. They were two independent systems doing two independent things at roughly the same moment in human time. That part is settled. What this is a story about contrast, because when you put these two events side by side, you get something more valuable than either of them on their own. You get a comparison, and the comparison reveals something that neither event reveals on its own. Kīlauea on May 5th was the baseline. It was the system as we understand it. Mantle plume, melting oceanic crust, episodic fountaining, cyclical pressure release, predictable cadence. We have been studying Kīlauea for over a century. We have wired the volcano up with seismometers, GPS stations, gas sensors, satellite radar, and tilt meters. We watch the magma chambers fill, we watch the pressure build, we watch the conduits open and close. When Kīlauea fountains for 9 hours and ejects 6 million cubic yards of basalt, that is not a surprise. That is the system telling us, exactly as we expected, that it is still doing its thing. The Hawaiian engine is, in this sense, the most well-behaved volcanic system on Earth. We can almost set our watches by it. Yellowstone, on the other hand, is doing something the textbooks did not predict. Specifically, Black Diamond Pool, a thermal feature that had sat quietly bubbling away for 152 years, suddenly started detonating. The first major explosion happened in 2024. Then, in late April of 2026, it exploded twice in less than a day. And the second explosion was larger than the first. 3 significant hydrothermal events in less than 2 years, at a single feature that had not done anything dramatic since before the United States had electric lighting. What changed? This is the question that should be making the hair on the back of your neck stand up, because the honest answer is, nobody is sure. The deep signals are quiet. The seismic networks beneath the park are not showing any unusual activity in the magma chamber. The ground deformation around Yellowstone Lake, which is one of the indicators scientists watch for signs of pressurization, has not done anything alarming. The gas emissions from the broader geothermal system are within normal ranges. The deep magma is not the answer. So whatever is driving this escalation at Black Diamond Pool, it is not coming from the engine room. It is coming from somewhere shallower, somewhere closer to the surface, somewhere in the plumbing, and that is where the unknowns start to pile up. Because the shallow plumbing of a hydrothermal system, the network of cracks and fissures and reservoirs that carry hot water through the rock, is incredibly difficult to map. We can see the surface, we can model the deep. But the middle, the layer where superheated water actually moves and pools and breaks through, is mostly invisible to us. We infer its behavior from what comes out the top. And when something starts coming out the top in unexpected ways, we have very few tools to understand why. So here is the contrast that defines this story. 2 American mantle plumes. One is producing exactly the surface behavior that the model predicts. The other is producing surface behavior that the model did not predict. And the difference between them is not what is happening at depth. It is what is happening in the parts of the system we cannot easily observe. To make sense of the anomaly at Yellowstone, we have to first understand the baseline at Hawaii in real detail. We have to walk through what an ongoing, healthy, well-behaved mantle plume eruption actually looks like. Because only then can we appreciate how strange the Yellowstone behavior really is. So let's go to Hawaii. Let's go inside episode 46, and let us watch a system that is working exactly the way it is supposed to work, so we can come back later and understand why the other system is not. Part 6. Episode 46 in context. To understand what happened at Kīlauea on May 5th, 2026, you first have to understand that this was not a sudden eruption. This was the latest beat in a rhythm that has been playing since December of 2024. Back in late 2024, after a relatively quiet period, Kīlauea reawakened at its summit. Specifically, the Halemaumau crater, which is the central pit at the top of the volcano, began producing what geologists started calling fountaining episodes. These are not continuous eruptions. They are discrete, punctuated bursts of activity, each one lasting from a few hours to a few days, separated by periods of quiet. The volcano fountains. It stops, it refills, it fountains again, and on it goes. By the time episode 46 lit up the night sky over Hawaii Island in early May, the volcano had already produced 45 previous episodes over a span of roughly 17 months. That is an average of one episode every 11 or 12 days, although in practice the spacing has varied. Some episodes have been just a few days apart, others have had pauses of 3 or 4 weeks. The cadence is not perfectly regular, but it is consistent enough that volcanologists have learned to anticipate the next one within a relatively narrow window. Episode 46 itself was, in many ways, a textbook performance. The fountain reached 650 feet in height. Now, that sounds enormous, and it is. But by the standards of this current eruption, it was actually on the lower end. Earlier episodes have produced fountains as high as 1,400 feet. So while 650 feet would have been the eruption of the decade for most volcanoes, in the context of this ongoing cycle, it was a moderately sized event. The plume that rose above it climbed to 20,000 feet, which is high enough to enter the lower stratosphere, but not high enough to disrupt global weather patterns. The total volume of erupted material came in at roughly 6 million cubic yards over a 9-hour window. Again, substantial, but in line with what the system has been producing. What is striking about all of this, and what connects directly back to our central thread, is how predictable the behaviour has become. This is the baseline. This is the system functioning. The volcano fills, pressurizes, releases, refills, and the cycle continues. There is variability in the details, but there is consistency in the overall shape of the cycle. This kind of behaviour tells us something important about how mantle plume volcanism works when the plumbing is mature and the system is operating normally. The magma chamber beneath the summit acts like a buffer. It receives a steady supply of fresh magma from depth, and it releases that magma in batches when the pressure gets high enough to overcome the strength of the rock containing it. This is why the eruption is episodic rather than continuous. The system needs time to refill between releases. It is in effect breathing. And here is the thing about a system that is breathing in a regular rhythm. It is contained. Despite the spectacle, despite the 60-story fountains, despite the ash plumes climbing 4 miles into the sky, all of this activity has stayed within the summit caldera. There has been no flank eruption. There has been no flow heading toward populated areas. There has been no rift zone activity. The volcano is, in a manner of speaking, performing for the cameras while keeping its hands inside the box. That containment is no accident. It is a clue to how the system is currently configured and a clue to what it might do next. Because while episodic summit fountaining is the current behaviour, mantle plume volcanoes do not stay in any one mode forever. The rhythm we are watching now is one chapter in a much longer book, and the next chapter, when it comes, may not look anything like this one. So what is actually driving these clean, repeatable cycles? What is making the system tick like a metronome? To answer that, we need to look at the part of the volcano that almost nobody talks about, the pressure cycle. Part 7. The pressure cycle nobody talks about. Imagine for a moment that you have a kettle on a stove. The kettle is full of water and the stove is on. Heat is being added at a steady rate. The water inside is getting hotter. Pressure is building inside the kettle, and eventually, when the pressure gets high enough, the kettle starts to whistle, releasing steam through the spout. Once enough steam has escaped, the pressure drops, the whistle stops, and the cycle begins again. That, in extremely simplified form, is what is happening at the summit of Kīlauea. Except, instead of water, the medium is molten rock. Instead of a stove, the heat source is a mantle plume, and instead of a kettle, the container is a complex network of magma chambers and conduits embedded in the structure of the volcano. The principle, however, is the same. Energy goes in, pressure builds, the system releases, the cycle repeats. Here is what is happening in slow motion between episodes. Magma is rising from the upper mantle into the deep storage zones beneath the volcano. From there, it migrates upward into shallower chambers close to the surface. As more magma arrives, the pressure in the shallow chamber rises. The walls of the chamber, made of relatively cool rock, can only contain so much pressure before they start to fail. When the pressure exceeds the strength of the surrounding rock, fractures open up, magma flows into those fractures, and a pathway to the surface is created. That is the eruption. Once the eruption begins, the pressure starts to drop almost immediately. The magma that has been waiting under pressure now has somewhere to go. It races upward through the new pathway, fountains out of the vent, and accumulates as fresh lava on the floor of the crater. As the pressure drops, the driving force for the eruption weakens. Eventually, there is no longer enough pressure to push magma to the surface. The fountain dies down, the vents seal up, the system goes quiet, and then it starts all over again. What is interesting, and what genuinely matters for understanding the story we are following, is that this cycle has been getting cleaner over time. The episodes during the first few months of the current eruption were more variable in their character. Some were short, some were long, some had unusually high fountains, some were strange and irregular in shape. But as the eruption has matured, the cycles have become more regular. The fountains start in a familiar way, they peak in a familiar way, they die down in a familiar way. The system is, in effect, optimizing itself. This is not unusual in geology. Many natural systems become more efficient at energy transfer as they evolve. A river, when it first cuts a channel through a landscape, takes a winding, irregular path. Over time, as the river matures, the path becomes smoother. Erosion carves out the most efficient route. The same kind of self-organization happens in volcanic plumbing. Each eruption modifies the plumbing system slightly. Pathways that work well get reinforced. Pathways that do not work well get sealed off. Over many cycles, the system converges on a configuration that releases pressure in the most efficient way possible. And here is the question that this raises, and it is a question that connects right back to the comparison we are building. If the system at Kīlauea is currently optimizing itself for clean, regular pressure release, what does that mean for the future? Does an efficient pressure release system mean the eruptions will stay small and predictable forever? Or does it mean that when something does eventually disrupt the cycle, the disruption will be much more dramatic than what we are seeing now? There is no clear answer to that question yet. But the contrast with Yellowstone is instructive. Yellowstone's hydrothermal system at Black Diamond Pool seems to be doing the opposite of what Kīlauea is doing. Instead of becoming smoother and more predictable, it appears to be becoming more erratic. Instead of converging on a clean cycle, it is diverging into something new. So whatever optimization process is making Hawaii more rhythmic, it is not happening in Wyoming. Or, if it is, the timescale is wildly different. So we have established that the Hawaiian system is in a relatively stable cyclic mode. Pressure is building, releasing, releasing. The cadence is regular. The output is contained. The system, for now, is breathing on its own time. But there is more to a volcanic system than just pressure. There is also geometry. The shape of the plumbing matters as much as the pressure inside it. And the geometry of Kīlauea's vents has been telling us something interesting too. Part 8. The geometry of the vents. If you have ever looked down into the Halemaumau crater from one of the overlooks, what you're seeing is essentially a basin within a basin. The outer caldera is a large depression, miles across. Inside that, the crater itself is a smaller pit, and at the bottom of that pit, scattered across the floor, are the vents, the actual openings through which lava reaches the surface. For most of the current eruption, two main vents have been doing the heavy lifting. There has been a north vent and a south vent. They sit relatively close to each other, both within the crater floor, and they have taken turns being the primary source of activity. Sometimes the south vent has been more active, sometimes the north vent has dominated, sometimes they have erupted simultaneously, producing twin fountains that merged into a single broader curtain of fire. Episode 46 was unusual in one specific way. The north vent did almost all of the work. The south vent, which had been quite active in earlier episodes, sat quiet during most of the 9-hour event. The fountain that we have been describing, the 650-foot tower of lava, came almost entirely out of the north vent. The south vent contributed essentially nothing. Now this might sound like a minor detail. So one vent did the work this time. Why does that matter? It matters because it tells us about the underground pathways that the magma is using to reach the surface, and those pathways are evolving. When a volcano first establishes a new magma supply route, the pathways tend to be irregular. Magma is opportunistic. It follows whatever cracks and fractures it can find. So in the early stages of an eruption, you often see multiple vents activating somewhat randomly, depending on which pathways happen to open up at any given moment. But as the eruption continues, certain pathways become preferred. The repeated flow of hot magma through a pathway widens it, smooths it, and makes it more thermally insulated. Eventually, the most efficient pathway becomes the dominant pathway, and the other pathways start to seal off. This is similar to what happens in a river system, although the timescale is different. When water first starts flowing across a flat surface, it spreads out into many small channels. Over time, the channels that carry the most water erode their beds the deepest, and they begin to capture water from the smaller channels. Eventually, you end up with one main river and a network of tributaries instead of a uniform sheet of water. The vent geometry at Kīlauea seems to be going through a similar consolidation. The north vent appears to be becoming the dominant pathway. The south vent, which was active for many of the early episodes, is being progressively bypassed. If this trend continues, future episodes may be entirely dominated by the north vent, and the south vent may eventually seal off completely. What does this mean for our central story? It means the system is still organising itself, even after 17 months of eruption. It has not reached a final equilibrium. It is converging, but it has not converged yet. And that ongoing reorganisation is part of what makes the Hawaiian baseline so useful as a comparison. We are watching, in real time, a mantle plume volcano sort itself out. We are seeing the engine smooth its own cylinders. But there is a flip side to this. A system that is locking into a single dominant pathway is also a system that is becoming more vulnerable to certain kinds of disruption. If the north vent is doing all the work, and something happens to obstruct the north vent, the pressure does not just disappear, it looks for somewhere else to go. And in a volcano, when pressure starts looking for somewhere else to go, the consequences can be unpredictable. So while the surface picture is one of increasing stability, the deeper picture is one of a system that is putting more and more of its eggs in one basket. That trade-off between stability and fragility is something we are going to come back to. Because if the current configuration is becoming locked in, then any future shift away from this configuration will not be subtle, it will be dramatic. And that brings us to the part of the story that nobody wants to talk about, the thing that should be happening, but is not. Part 9. The Missing Escalation. If you have been following Hawaii volcano news for any length of time, you remember 2018. That summer, Kīlauea did something it had not done in living memory at that scale. It erupted not from its summit, but from a place called the Lower East Rift Zone, dozens of miles away from Halemaumau. Lava poured out of fissures in the ground in residential neighbourhoods. Hundreds of homes were destroyed. Entire subdivisions like Leilani estates were buried under fresh lava flows. Roads were cut. Coastal areas were reshaped. The 2018 Lower East Rift Zone eruption was a reminder that Kīlauea is not just a summit volcano. It is a volcano with multiple personalities. It can erupt at the summit, where the spectacle is contained within the caldera, or it can erupt along its flanks, through a network of long fractures called rift zones, which extend for miles in either direction from the summit. When it erupts along the rift zones, the consequences for human populations are enormous. So here is the question that should be hanging over our entire conversation about Hawaii. Why is episode 46 and all the episodes before it happening at the summit when the system has clearly demonstrated that it can erupt along the rift zones too? Why is the magma not finding its way out through the flanks? The answer, as best we can tell, comes back to the pressure cycle and the geometry we have just been discussing. The summit pathway is currently the path of least resistance. Magma rising from the deep system finds it easier to reach the surface through the summit conduits than through the rift zones. So as long as the summit conduits are open and functioning efficiently, the pressure releases through the summit and the rift zones stay quiet. But this is where it gets uncomfortable, because the magma supply rate from the deep system has not slowed down. The mantle plume is still delivering hot rock at roughly the same rate it has been delivering it for decades, so all of that magma is going somewhere. And right now it is mostly going out through the summit, in the form of these episodic fountains. But what if the summit pathway gets restricted? What if the dominant north vent we just talked about gets sealed off? What if the system reaches its maximum sustainable summit eruption rate? In all of those scenarios, the rift zones become the alternative pathway. The pressure that cannot release through the summit will look for another way out, and historically, the way out has been through the East Rift Zone or the Southwest Rift Zone, both of which extend through populated and economically important parts of Hawaii Island. There is a hypothesis that some volcanologists have been quietly discussing. The hypothesis is that the summit eruption is, in effect, buffering the system. It is absorbing pressure that might otherwise have to go somewhere else. The longer the summit keeps performing in its current cycle, the longer the rift zones stay quiet. But that buffering has limits. At some point, the system will shift, and nobody knows exactly when that shift will happen or how much warning we will get. This connects right back to our central theme. We have been talking about how Kīlauea is the baseline, the well-behaved system, the volcano that is performing exactly as expected, and all of that is true, but there is a layer of unease underneath even that baseline behaviour. Because the more efficient and consolidated the current cycle becomes, the harder it becomes to predict what happens when the cycle eventually breaks. And cycles always eventually break. That is just how volcanoes work. The monitoring networks watching Kīlauea are some of the best in the world. There are seismometers, GPS stations, tilt meters, gas sensors, satellite radar systems, infrared cameras and webcams trained on every relevant part of the volcano. When the system does eventually shift modes, we will probably see some warning signs. But the question is not whether we will see warning signs. The question is whether we will see them in time, and whether we will correctly interpret what they mean. So even Hawaii, the baseline system, has uncertainty in it. It is just a different kind of uncertainty than what we see at Yellowstone. Hawaii's uncertainty is about when the current mode will end. Yellowstone's uncertainty is about why the current mode is happening at all. Both systems are, in their own ways, telling us that the limits of our knowledge are closer than we like to admit. To really appreciate that, we need to step back and look at Hawaii not on the timescale of months or years, but on the timescale of millions of years. Because on that scale, Kīlauea is not the final word. It is just the latest word in a story that has been writing itself for a very long time. Part 10. The Long Game of the Hawaiian Plume. If you pull up a bathymetric map of the Pacific Ocean, the kind of map that shows the topography of the seafloor, you will see something extraordinary. There is a long, almost impossibly long chain of underwater mountains stretching from the Hawaiian Islands all the way to the Aleutian Trench off the coast of Russia. The chain is not a straight line. It bends sharply about midway through, but it is unbroken. It is a single, continuous volcanic feature, thousands of miles in length. That feature is called the Hawaiian Emperor Seamount Chain, and it is the surface track of the Hawaiian mantle plume, written across the floor of the Pacific Ocean over the course of the last 80 million years. Here is how it works. The Hawaiian plume, the deep column of hot rock we have been talking about, has been sitting in roughly the same place beneath the Pacific Ocean for 80 million years. It might wobble a little, it might shift slightly over geologic time. But by and large, it has been in the same neighbourhood for almost 100 million years. In the meantime, the Pacific Plate, which is the tectonic plate that the seafloor in this region is built on, has been moving. The Pacific Plate has been sliding northwest at roughly 4 inches per year, on average, for tens of millions of years. So picture this, the plume is fixed, the plate is moving, the plume punches a volcano up through the plate carries that volcano away from the plume, a new volcano is born above the plume. Repeat, 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 for 80 million years. The result is a chain of volcanoes that gets older as you move away from the active hotspot. The youngest volcano is the one currently sitting over the plume, which is essentially the big island of Hawaii where Kīlauea lives. The next youngest are the older Hawaiian islands like Maui, Molokai, Oahu and Kauai, each progressively older as you move northwest. Beyond Kauai, the chain continues, but the volcanoes are no longer above water. They have eroded down to seamounts, hidden beneath the surface of the ocean. The chain extends thousands of miles, all the way to the Aleutian Trench, where the oldest seamounts are finally being subducted back into the mantle. And here is the part that is wild. There is a kink in the chain. About halfway along, the chain bends sharply. The Hawaiian portion runs roughly east to west. The Emperor portion, the older half, runs roughly north to south. That bend is dated to about 47 million years ago, and it represents either a change in the direction the Pacific plate was moving, or a shift in the plume itself, or some combination. The exact cause is still debated, but the bend is there, frozen into the geometry of the seafloor, like a kink in a wire that records a moment when something changed. Now, here is something you might not have known. The next Hawaiian island is already forming. It is just not above water yet. About 20 miles southeast of the big island, on the seafloor, there is a young volcano called Kīlauea, which used to be called Loihi. It is currently about 3,000 feet below the surface of the Pacific, but it is growing. Magma from the same plume that feeds Kīlauea is also feeding Kīlauea, and over the course of tens of thousands of years, that volcano will continue to grow until it eventually breaks the surface and becomes the newest island in the Hawaiian chain. The big island, meanwhile, will keep moving northwest, and eventually it will erode and subside into the ocean, just like all the older islands. What this tells us, and what connects directly back to our central thread, is that what we are watching at Kīlauea right now is not a beginning. It is not an end. It is a moment in deep time. Episode 46 was 9 hours of a story that has been unfolding for 80 million years, and that will continue unfolding for tens of millions of years more. The fountain we saw in May 2026 was, in geologic terms, a single breath of an extremely long-lived organism. That perspective is worth holding on to, because when we move next to Yellowstone, we're going to see a system that, on a deep time level, is also part of an enormous story. The Yellowstone hotspot has its own track record across the continent, its own Snake River plain, its own ancient calderas marking the path of North America over the plume. But Yellowstone is doing something on the surface right now that Hawaii is not. It is producing surface behavior that does not match what the deep timeline predicts. And that mismatch is the heart of our story. So let us turn now from the system that is working to the system that is doing something strange. Let us go from the fountain that anyone could see to the explosions that almost nobody understood. Let us go to Wyoming and to a single thermal pool that has decided, for reasons we cannot yet explain, to start detonating. Part 11. The double explosion problem. Here is what makes the Black Diamond Pool event so unsettling, and I want to walk through this carefully because the detail is what matters. On April 28, 2026, the first explosion occurred. Witnesses heard a low rumble, then a sudden crack, and then a column of mud, water and debris rose into the air. Boulders were ejected. The boardwalk near the pool was coated in fresh mud and rock fragments. Steam billowed for several minutes after the initial blast. The event was quickly classified as a hydrothermal explosion. Park geologists arrived to assess the damage. The pool itself had been altered. Some of the surrounding ground had collapsed. The water level and chemistry had shifted. Now, in the standard model of hydrothermal explosions, this is what should have happened next. The explosion should have released the pressure that had been building up inside the system. The plumbing should have been opened. The hot water that had been trapped should have escaped. And the system should have settled into a new, lower pressure state, where it would remain for some period of time before potentially building up pressure again. That is the model. That is what should have happened. Instead, less than 24 hours later, on April 29th, the same pool exploded again, and this time, the explosion was larger than the first one. This is the part that is genuinely strange, because if the first explosion had released the pressure, the second explosion should have either not happened at all, or it should have been smaller, drawing on whatever residual pressure was left in the system. But it was not smaller, it was bigger, which means that in the 24-hour window between the two events, something in the local plumbing actually increased the pressure rather than decreased it. How does a system that has just released pressure manage to repressurize fast enough to produce a larger explosion within a day? That is the question that nobody has a confident answer to. There are a few hypotheses, and we will get into the leading one in detail in the next section. But the broad strokes are these. Either the first explosion did not actually release the pressure that geologists initially assumed it had released, meaning it failed to fully open the system, or the first explosion changed the geometry of the plumbing in such a way that a deeper, larger reservoir of pressurized water became suddenly accessible to the surface. Or, in the worst case, there was no pre-existing pressure imbalance at all, and the second explosion was driven by a fresh, rapid input of energy from somewhere else in the system. None of these are fully satisfying. All of them imply that the standard hydrothermal explosion model does not perfectly describe what is happening at Black Diamond Pool. This connects right back to our central thread, and I want to make it explicit because we are now diving into a secondary topic and I do not want us to drift. At Kīlauea, the system is releasing pressure in clean, predictable cycles. Pressure builds, fountain happens, pressure drops, pause, repeat. The pattern is so consistent that it is becoming a textbook case of how a healthy mantle plume volcano operates. At Yellowstone's Black Diamond Pool, the pressure cycle is doing the opposite. It is releasing, then somehow rebuilding faster than expected, and then releasing more violently. Two systems with similar deep origins. Two completely different patterns of pressure behavior at the surface. The contrast is the story. So what is going on inside the plumbing of Black Diamond Pool? What could allow a hydrothermal system to repressurize in less than a day after a major release? To answer that, we have to leave the surface and go down into the cracks. Part 12. The plumbing hypothesis. The leading hypothesis among hydrothermal geologists, the one that does the best job of explaining the double explosion, has to do with a process that happens slowly over long periods of time but can have very sudden consequences. It involves the chemistry of silica. Hydrothermal systems are full of dissolved silica. As hot water moves through the rock beneath a feature like Black Diamond Pool, it picks up silica from the surrounding minerals. That silica stays in solution as long as the water is hot and under pressure. But when the water cools, or when the pressure drops, the silica starts to come out of solution. It precipitates onto the walls of the cracks and conduits that the water is moving through. Slowly, year by year, decade by decade, those silica deposits build up. The conduits get narrower, the plumbing gets restricted, the system becomes more closed off. For a long time, this process can go on without any visible consequence at the surface. The pool might bubble, the water might be hot, tourists might walk past it on a boardwalk and never realize that beneath their feet, the pathways through the rock are slowly being plastered over with mineral deposits. But pressure does not disappear just because the conduits are narrowing. The hot water below is still being heated, the pressure is still building, it is just being trapped behind an increasingly thick layer of silica. Then, one day, the seal fails, the silica plug cracks, the trapped water, which has been pressurized for decades or even centuries, suddenly has somewhere to go. It rushes upward. As it rises, the pressure drops. As the pressure drops, the water boils. As it boils, it expands enormously, somewhere on the order of 1,500 times its original volume in the transition from liquid to vapor. That sudden expansion is the explosion. If this is what happened at Black Diamond Pool, then the first explosion on April 28th would have been the moment the silica seal broke. The trapped water rushed up, expanded violently, and produced the first event. But here is the wrinkle. If the conduit had been heavily restricted for 152 years, then the volume of trapped water below it could have been substantial. And if the first explosion only cleared a portion of that volume, the rest would still have been down there, still under pressure, and now with a freshly opened pathway leading to the surface. Less than 24 hours later, that deeper reservoir found its way up. And because it had farther to travel and more energy stored in it, the second explosion was larger than the first. This is the plumbing hypothesis. It is essentially a multi-stage uncorking of a system that had been sealed for a very long time, and it is the most parsimonious explanation we have for the observed sequence of events. There is an alternative hypothesis, although it has less supporting evidence. Some have suggested that a fresh pulse of heat from deeper in the system could be driving the increased activity at Black Diamond Pool. In this model, instead of just a passive uncorking of stored pressure, there would be an active increase in the energy being delivered to the system. Maybe a new pathway from the magma chamber, maybe a small intrusion of fresh magma at depth. But here is the problem with this hypothesis. The deep monitoring instruments at Yellowstone are not showing the kinds of signals you would expect to see if a fresh pulse of magmatic heat were being delivered. There is no anomalous deformation. There is no unusual pattern of deep earthquakes. There is no shift in the broader gas chemistry of the park. So while we cannot rule out a fresh heat input, the data does not support it strongly. This is where the central thread comes back into focus. At Hawaii, we can see what is happening at depth. The deformation, the gas, the seismicity, all of these are showing us a clear picture of magma movement through a relatively well-mapped plumbing system. We watch the engine work. At Yellowstone, the deep signals are quiet. The engine room is not telling us anything unusual, so whatever is driving the escalation at Black Diamond Pool is happening shallower than the engine room. It is happening in the layer above the deep magma, in a tangle of cracks and conduits that are extremely difficult for us to image directly. The shallow unknowns, in this case, are dominating over the well-modelled deep processes, and that imbalance is a bigger statement than any single explosion. It is saying that our blind spot is not in the basement, it is on the second floor. So the plumbing hypothesis suggests that what we are seeing is the beginning of a sequence of events as the system reorganises its shallow architecture after a century and a half of slow sealing. If that is correct, then this is not a one-off. It is a pattern that has only just started to express itself, and the timeline of events at Black Diamond Pool supports that idea. Part 13, the escalation curve. Let us look at the actual sequence at this single thermal feature, because the rate of change is the part that should make you sit up. Before 2024, Black Diamond Pool had not produced a major hydrothermal explosion in 152 years. It bubbled, it steamed, it changed temperature seasonally, but it did not explode. For 152 years, this feature was by any reasonable definition dormant in terms of explosive activity. It was just another pretty hot spring in a park full of pretty hot springs. In 2024, that changed. A significant hydrothermal explosion occurred at Black Diamond Pool. Boulders were thrown, boardwalks were damaged, park officials closed the area. It was, at the time, treated as a notable but ultimately isolated event. The interpretation was that something in the plumbing had finally given way after a long build-up, and that the system would now settle into a new, lower pressure equilibrium. Standard model, standard interpretation. Then, less than 2 years later, in late April 2026, the pool exploded twice in 24 hours, with the second event larger than the first. So the count is now 0, 1, then 2 within a day. From 0 events in 152 years to 3 significant explosions in less than 2 years. That is not a smooth, continuous escalation. That is a step change. The system has clearly transitioned out of the stable regime it was in before 2024 and into something else. What that something else is exactly, we do not yet know. For context, hydrothermal explosions are not unheard of in Yellowstone in general. The park has thousands of thermal features, and small steam explosions happen somewhere in the park every year. Larger explosions happen less frequently, on the order of 1 or 2 per decade across the entire park, but the concentration of multiple significant events at a single feature in such a short window is unusual. It suggests that something specific to Black Diamond Pool has changed, and whatever changed, it has changed the local equilibrium of that feature. That is the language scientists use, the language of equilibrium. A stable system sits at one equilibrium for a long time, then transitions to a new equilibrium, and then sits at the new equilibrium for a different long time. The transitions, when they happen, can be sudden and dramatic. Black Diamond Pool appears to be in the middle of a transition. The old equilibrium, the one that lasted from the 1870s until 2024, is gone. The new equilibrium has not yet established itself. The system is between states, and in that liminal period the behaviour is unpredictable. This is reminiscent of a process that geologists have studied in other geyser systems around the world. Sometimes a geyser that has been dormant for decades will suddenly reactivate. Sometimes a geyser that has been erupting on a regular schedule will go quiet. The reasons are usually local. A change in the underground plumbing, a shift in the water table, a small earthquake nearby that altered the geometry of the cracks. The deep magmatic system is rarely the proximate cause. It is usually something shallower, something more local, something that we cannot directly observe. And here, again, is where the comparison to Hawaii becomes useful. At Hawaii, we are seeing a system that is becoming more regular over time. At Yellowstone's Black Diamond Pool, we are seeing a system that is becoming less regular. Both systems are evolving. Both systems are changing, but they are changing in opposite directions. The escalation at Black Diamond Pool is evidence of hidden variables in plume systems, variables that we have not fully accounted for in our models. The deep engine, the broad hotspot, can be quiet, while the shallow expression at a single feature is undergoing dramatic reorganization. And that reorganization tells us that there are forces at work in the plumbing that we are still learning to recognize. So what is the deep engine actually doing? If the surface anomaly at Black Diamond Pool is not being driven from below, what is the deep system telling us? The answer, surprisingly, is that the deep system has a few surprises of its own. Part 14. The Offset Plume Revelation. In the last few years, seismic tomography studies of the Yellowstone region have produced a finding that genuinely altered how scientists think about this hotspot. Tomography is essentially a way of taking a CT scan of the Earth's interior using earthquake waves. As waves travel through the planet, they speed up or slow down depending on the temperature and composition of the rock they are passing through. By recording the same waves at many different stations and analysing how their travel times vary, scientists can build a three-dimensional image of the subsurface. What recent tomography has shown is that the deep heat source feeding Yellowstone, the actual mantle plume route, is not directly underneath Yellowstone National Park. It is offset. It sits hundreds of miles away from the caldera, deeper in the mantle, and the heat travels laterally before rising up to where the surface volcanism actually expresses itself. In effect, the chimney is not directly above the fire. There is a bend in the plumbing. This finding matters for our story for a specific reason. It means that the area where dangerous activity could potentially occur is not limited to the boundaries of Yellowstone National Park. The actual deep system extends well beyond the park, into Idaho and possibly into parts of Nevada. The boundaries we see on a map, the ones drawn in the 1870s to define the park, have nothing to do with the geometry of the deep heat source. They are administrative boundaries. The plume does not care about administrative boundaries. This connects directly back to our central thread because it reinforces just how poorly mapped these deep systems still are. We have known about the Yellowstone hotspot for decades. We have studied it. We have written textbooks about it. And only recently have we figured out that the deep source is actually offset from the surface expression. That is not a minor refinement. That is a fundamental restructuring of our understanding of where the system actually lives. If we got the geometry wrong for so long, what else have we gotten wrong? What else are we currently getting wrong? Part 15. The Hidden Risk Map. Building on that, the practical implication of the offset plume finding is that the risk envelope around Yellowstone is larger than the park boundaries suggest. There are geothermal anomalies in parts of Idaho that may be related to the broader Yellowstone system. There are areas of unusual heat flow that align with the inferred path of lateral heat transport. None of this means that there is going to be an eruption in Idaho tomorrow. The risk of any near-term eruption anywhere in the broader Yellowstone system remains very low. But the area that should, in principle, be monitored as part of the same system is larger than the park itself. There is also speculation, and I want to be careful here because the evidence is thin, that some of the geothermal signatures in the region could indicate connections to other heat sources further west. Whether these are part of the same plume system or are independent features is genuinely not clear. The data does not yet support a strong claim either way, but the speculation exists, and it is part of why some researchers have been arguing for an expanded geographic scope when thinking about American mantle plume risk. And this loops back to the central thread once more. Risk boundaries do not match visible features. The boardwalk where Black Diamond Pool exploded looks like a quiet hot spring on a Tuesday morning. The deep source feeding the broader Yellowstone system sits hundreds of miles from the famous geysers. The mismatch between what we can see and what is actually shaping the danger is the recurring lesson of this entire story. Both at Hawaii and at Yellowstone, the surface is an imperfect translator of what is happening below. So what are people online saying about all of this? Because while the science is still working through the implications, the internet has already produced its own theories. And some of those theories are worth examining if only to understand why our brains are so eager to connect things that are not actually connected. Part 16. The Global Awakening Narrative. If you spent any time on social media during the first week of May 2026, you saw the claim and you saw it everywhere. The Earth is waking up, the plates are shifting, the hotspots are activating. Yellowstone is rumbling, Hawaii is fountaining, the Aleutians are shaking, the Philippines are trembling, the Kermadec Trench is groaning. Something big is coming, something is changing. The planet, the Post told us, is sending us a message, and if we are paying attention, we will see it. The clips were stitched together with dramatic music. The maps were dotted with red circles. The voiceovers were urgent, breathless, certain. Tens of millions of people watched these compilations in the span of a few days. The comment sections filled up with the same recurring sentiment. We knew it. It is happening. We are running out of time. I want to take this seriously, and I want to be clear about why. Not because the claim is correct, because the claim, when you actually examine it, falls apart under any kind of scrutiny. I want to take it seriously because the impulse behind it is genuinely worth understanding. There is a reason that millions of intelligent, thoughtful, otherwise skeptical people watched those compilations and felt, in their gut, that the pattern was real. That gut feeling is not stupidity. It is not gullibility. It is in fact one of the oldest and most successful adaptations in the history of life on this planet. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. Our brains are built to find connections between events, even when no connection exists. This is not a flaw. This is a survival adaptation honed over millions of years, in the ancestral environment, on the savannas and in the forest where our distant ancestors lived and died. The organism that noticed that the rustling in the bushes correlated with the appearance of predators had a much better chance of surviving than the organism that did not. The hominid that connected the smell of distant smoke with the danger of approaching fire lived to reproduce. The one that did not, did not. Pattern recognition kept our ancestors alive. It is, in a very real sense, why you're here right now to watch this video. The same machinery in your brain that makes you see a face in a cloud, or hear your name in a noisy room, or feel like someone is staring at you across a crowded space is the machinery that kept your great-great-great-great-grandparents from being eaten. But here is the problem. That machinery was calibrated for a world in which the only correlations you ever encountered were the ones happening in your immediate physical environment. The rustle in the bushes was actually correlated with the predator, because the predator was actually there, 10 feet from you. Your brain was designed to find patterns in a small, local, high-stakes informational landscape. It was not designed for the world we now live in. It was not designed for cable news. It was not designed for global aggregator feeds. It was not designed for an algorithm that can pull together every dramatic event from every corner of the planet in real time, package them into a 60-second compilation, and serve them up to you while you're eating breakfast. In the modern world, we have access to data streams our ancestors could not have conceived of. Every earthquake above magnitude 4 anywhere on Earth gets logged, mapped, and shared within minutes. Every volcanic event, no matter how minor, generates news coverage somewhere. Every unusual weather pattern, every wildfire, every sinkhole, every aurora gets photographed, posted, and amplified across networks that span the globe. So when we open our phones, we are not seeing the world we evolved to interpret. We are seeing a curated, compressed, dramatically edited highlight reel of every notable thing that happened on a planet of 8 billion people across 200 million square miles of land and ocean. And our pattern recognition machinery, which is still running on ancient firmware, looks at that highlight reel and does what it has always done. It finds connections, it draws lines between dots, it tells us, with absolute certainty, that this all means something. Most of those connections are coincidental. The Earth is a noisy, energetic, continuously active system. There are roughly 50 volcanoes erupting at any given moment somewhere on the planet. There are hundreds of earthquakes above magnitude 4 every single week. There are thousands of small thermal events, mudslides, landslides, ice quakes, and atmospheric anomalies happening every day that nobody ever hears about because they are not dramatic enough to clip and share. So when we see a fountain in Hawaii, an explosion in Wyoming, an earthquake in Alaska, and a tremor in the Philippines all in the same week, our brains tell us this must mean something, when in fact weeks like this happen more often than we realize. We just only notice them when something dramatic happens to crystallize the pattern in our minds. The week before, the week after, the same kinds of events were happening. We just were not looking. The compilation video just had not been made yet. There is a name for this in statistics. It is called survivorship bias, although in this case it is more like attention bias. The data points that draw our notice are not a random sample of everything that happens. They are the data points that something or someone has selected for us to see. And once a few notable things have been selected and presented as a cluster, our brains finish the job. We see the cluster, we feel the meaning, we tell ourselves the story. And the story feels so true, so obviously correct, that questioning it starts to feel like denial, like we are the ones with our heads in the sand, like everyone else can see the pattern, and we are just refusing to look. I get it. I really do. I have felt that pull myself, more times than I would like to admit. The sensation of seeing a hidden order in events is one of the most powerful experiences a human brain can produce. It activates the same circuits as religious revelation, as falling in love, as solving a difficult puzzle after hours of work. There is a deep cognitive reward for connecting dots, and the deeper and more far-reaching the connection, the bigger the reward. Which means that the most viral patterns, the ones that spread fastest across social media, are not necessarily the ones that are true. They are the ones that produce the strongest cognitive reward when believed. That is a very different filter from the one that produces accurate models of reality. This loops back to our central thread, and I want to make this connection explicit because it matters. There is a difference between a perceived pattern and a real unknown, and confusing the two is exactly how the public conversation about events like this goes off the rails. The perceived pattern is the global awakening narrative. The Earth is talking to us, the hotspots are coordinating, the ring of fire is pulsing, the plates are conspiring. None of that is supported by the evidence. It is mostly a story we are telling ourselves, assembled out of scattered events that our ancient pattern recognition machinery has been duped into seeing as a unified whole. The real unknown is what is happening at Black Diamond Pool. That is a specific, local, well-defined mystery. A pool that was quiet for 152 years has now produced 3 significant explosions in less than 2 years, and the second of the recent 2 was larger than the first. Scientists do not have a confident explanation for that escalation. The data does not yet point clearly to one mechanism over another. That is a genuine unknown. That is a real gap in our understanding. The difference between those 2 categories matters. Perceived patterns dissolve when you examine them carefully, because there was never anything there to begin with. Real unknowns get sharper when you examine them carefully, because there is something there, and the closer you look, the more clearly you see the shape of what we do not yet understand. A perceived pattern is satisfied by belief. A real unknown is satisfied only by evidence. And one of the most important things you can do, as someone trying to think clearly about events like the ones we are following, is to keep those 2 categories separate in your mind. Confusing the first for the second is exactly how the public conversation goes off the rails. The conspiracy threads inflate the perceived pattern into a cosmic event, while the official statements deflate the real unknown into routine monitoring. Both responses miss the actual story. There is real stuff to be uneasy about during the first week of May 2026. It is just not the global awakening. It is the pool that is not behaving the way it should be. The thing we should be paying attention to is not the noise of 100 unrelated events around the planet. It is the signal of one specific feature on American soil doing something we cannot yet explain. That is what most people are pointing at, and that is exactly the thing most people are missing. Part 17. Solar Activity Hypothesis. Now, I promised earlier that we would touch on space weather, because this is the kind of fringe hypothesis that I find genuinely worth examining, even when the evidence is thin. And I want to be upfront about why I am willing to spend time on it. This is the Skylab, and on this channel we do not just throw out ideas because they live outside the comfortable zone of mainstream consensus. We examine them, we pressure test them, we see how much weight they can actually hold. Some of them collapse immediately, some of them turn out to be onto something real. The only way to know which is to take them seriously enough to look at them carefully, and the question of whether the sun could be influencing what happens beneath our feet is exactly that kind of question. Here is the context. We are currently in or near the peak of solar cycle 25, the latest in a series of 11-year cycles of activity on the sun that scientists have been tracking systematically since the 1700s. The sun is not a static object. It pulses, it breathes. Its magnetic field flips polarity on a regular schedule, and as it does, the level of activity on its surface waxes and wanes. During the quiet parts of the cycle, called solar minimum, the surface is mostly clear. There are few sunspots. The flares are weak and infrequent. The corona, that ghostly halo of plasma surrounding the sun, calms down. During the active parts of the cycle, called solar maximum, the surface erupts. Sunspots multiply. Flares become more frequent and more violent. Coronal mass ejections, those enormous bubbles of plasma and magnetic field that the sun occasionally hurls into space become more common. And right now, in the spring of 2026, we are sitting close to the top of the latest active phase. There has been increased speculation in some scientific circles, and certainly in plenty of amateur circles, about whether enhanced solar activity could correlate with increased geological activity on Earth. The intuition behind the speculation is straightforward. The sun is the dominant external energy source for our planet. When the sun is more active, more energy reaches Earth in various forms. So the reasoning goes, if the planet is going to respond to anything from the outside, it should respond to that. And given that we are currently in or near solar maximum, and we are also seeing dramatic activity at multiple American hotspots in the same week, is it really impossible that the two are connected? The honest answer is, the evidence does not support a strong claim. Some studies have suggested very weak statistical correlations between solar phenomena and certain types of seismicity. A handful of papers, going back several decades, have tried to find connections between sunspot cycles and earthquake frequency, or between geomagnetic storm intensity and volcanic eruption rates. The results have been mixed at best. Other studies, examining the same data with different methods, have found no correlation at all. Where weak correlations have been reported, they tend to be small in magnitude, hard to replicate, and easy to attribute to statistical artifacts rather than genuine causal links. The picture, taken as a whole, is inconclusive. There is no smoking gun. There is no clean signal jumping out of the noise. There is just a lot of researchers looking at a lot of data and not really agreeing on what, if anything, is there. The mechanistic problem with the hypothesis, however, is what really gives me pause, and this is the part that I think gets glossed over in most of the online discussions of this topic, so I want to walk through it slowly. The energy delivered to Earth's surface by even an extreme solar event is, by orders of magnitude, smaller than the energy involved in volcanic and seismic processes. We are not talking about a small difference. We are talking about a vast, almost cosmic mismatch in scale. Consider the energies at play. The kinetic energy of a hydrothermal explosion at Black Diamond Pool is enormous. We are talking about boulders the size of basketballs being hurled through the air at speeds high enough to splinter trees. The energy involved in fountaining lava out of Kīlauea, 650 feet into the air sustained for 9 hours, is even more enormous. We are talking about millions of tons of molten rock, heated to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, being moved against gravity at very high velocity. The total energy budget of these events runs into the joules of, well, frankly absurd numbers with so many zeros that they stop being meaningful to most human intuitions. Now, what is the energy budget of a major solar event hitting the upper atmosphere? Non-trivial, certainly. Geomagnetic storms can induce currents in long conductors. They can disrupt satellites. They can cause auroras to appear at unusually low latitudes. They can occasionally damage power grids, as happened most famously during the Quebec blackout of 1989. These are real effects. They are measurable. They are, in some cases, expensive. But the total amount of energy being delivered to the surface of the planet by even an extreme solar storm is many, many orders of magnitude less than the energy involved in moving mountains. Much of that solar energy is intercepted by the atmosphere and the magnetosphere before it ever reaches the ground. What does reach the ground is concentrated in electromagnetic effects, not the kind of mechanical or thermal energy that could meaningfully influence deep Earth processes. So even if there were a correlation, finding a physical mechanism that could turn that small energy input into a measurable effect on volcanic behavior is genuinely difficult. You would need a kind of leverage, a way for a tiny external nudge to trigger a much larger internal release of stored energy. That is not impossible in principle. Many natural systems are sensitive to small triggers when they are sitting close to a critical threshold. Avalanches start with a single snowflake. Earthquakes can be triggered by very small stress changes when a fault is already loaded near its breaking point, so the trigger model is not absurd. But it requires very specific conditions, and it requires that the system be primed to fail anyway. The trigger does not provide the energy. It just times the release. That said, there are some speculative pathways worth mentioning, because I want to be fair to the hypothesis. Geomagnetic disturbances during solar storms induce electrical currents in the ground. We call these telluric currents, and they are most pronounced in regions with conductive subsurface materials. Hydrothermal systems, which are full of mineral-rich water, are exactly the kind of environment where induced currents can flow. Those currents could, in principle, slightly alter the behaviour of conductive fluids in shallow hydrothermal systems. They could theoretically shift the chemistry of mineral precipitation. They could, in extreme cases, contribute to the breakdown of silica seals in hydrothermal plumbing, which, as we discussed earlier, is one of the leading hypotheses for what happened at Black Diamond Pool. But here is the key word in all of those sentences: theoretically. The magnitudes involved are tiny. The pathways are speculative. No one has demonstrated a clear causal link between any specific solar event and any specific volcanic or hydrothermal event on Earth. The mechanisms exist on paper, but the evidence does not yet support the claim that they actually drive significant geological behaviour, so this remains in the speculative realm. Interesting to think about. Worth keeping an eye on, especially as we accumulate more data over multiple solar cycles, but not currently supported by strong evidence. If you encounter someone online claiming, with confidence, that solar activity caused the recent events at Yellowstone or Kīlauea, you should be sceptical. The claim is going beyond what the data supports. That does not make the underlying question wrong to ask, it just makes the answer not yet available. This connects back to the central thread because it reinforces the limits of our current understanding. We do not have a complete model of how external energy inputs to the Earth system might interact with internal geological processes. We have approximations, we have models, we have statistical analyses, we have careful papers and rigorous peer-reviewed studies. But we do not have certainty. We do not have a unified theory of how the planet responds or fails to respond to influences from outside its own boundaries. There are gaps. There are places where the data is sparse, where the mechanisms are unclear, where the experts genuinely disagree. And in the absence of certainty, hypotheses proliferate. Some of them are reasonable. They're grounded in plausible physics. They make testable predictions. They are open to revision based on new evidence. Other hypotheses are not reasonable. They invoke mechanisms that violate basic physics. They make claims that cannot be falsified. They thrive on confirmation bias and ignore disconfirming evidence. Both kinds of hypotheses can sound similar at first glance, especially when they are presented in confident tones by charismatic voices. The discipline is in knowing which is which. The discipline is in being willing to hold the question open, to acknowledge what we do not yet understand, and to refuse to fill that uncertainty with a story just because the silence is uncomfortable. 2 American hotspots are doing things we are still working to interpret. The honest answer is that we are watching, we are measuring, and we are trying to figure it out. That is enough. That has to be enough, until the data tells us more. Part 18. Are mantle plumes connected? This is the deeper version of the same question, and I want you to follow me down for a minute because we are about to leave the surface and go to a place that almost no human conversation ever visits. Forget the sun for a moment. Forget surface coincidences. Forget the weekly news cycle and the social media compilations and the cable graphics with the red dots blinking on the map. Set all of that aside. The question we are about to ask is older and stranger and more fundamental than any of that. Could the mantle plumes themselves be connected to each other? Not at the surface, where they have nothing to do with one another, not through the atmosphere, where the energy budget does not work. But far below, in the part of the planet that we can barely image and almost cannot model, could there be a real, physical connection between the deep roots of distant hotspots? There is a real scientific concept that bears on this question, and it is one of the strangest discoveries of the last few decades of geophysics. Geophysicists have identified 2 enormous structures in the deep mantle, near the core mantle boundary, that they call large low shear velocity provinces. The acronym is LLSVPs, and once you know it, you will start seeing it in technical papers and you will recognize that you are looking at something genuinely weird. There is one of these structures beneath Africa and another beneath the Pacific Ocean. They sit on opposite sides of the planet, almost antipodal to each other. They are roughly the size of continents. Some estimates suggest they may be even larger than continents, sprawling across millions of square kilometers of the lowermost mantle. They sit thousands of kilometers down, perched just above the molten outer core, in a region of the planet that we have never directly sampled, and probably never will. How do we know they are there? The answer is seismic tomography, which I mentioned earlier in the context of the Yellowstone plume offset finding. When earthquakes happen anywhere on Earth, they send seismic waves travelling outward through the planet's interior. Those waves move at different speeds depending on the temperature, density and composition of the rock they pass through. By recording the same earthquake at hundreds or thousands of stations around the world, and by analysing how the travel times of the waves vary across all those paths, scientists can build up a three-dimensional image of the planet's interior. It is essentially a CT scan of the Earth, assembled out of natural seismic events instead of medical X-rays. When you do this kind of imaging, the LLSVPs jump out clearly. They show up as regions where seismic shear waves move noticeably slower than they do in the surrounding mantle. That is what the awkward name actually means. Large means they are continent-sized. Low shear velocity means seismic waves slow down inside them. Province means they are coherent, distinguishable regions of the deep mantle. Some scientists call them by a different name, the African blob and the Pacific blob, which is more colourful but less precise. Whatever you want to call them, they are real, in the sense that they show up consistently in independent seismic tomography studies, done by different research groups using different methods. Multiple lines of evidence point to their existence. They are not artifacts of one particular analytical technique. They are features of the actual planet. Their composition, however, is intensely debated. Some researchers think they are simply regions of unusually hot mantle, where high temperatures slow down the seismic waves. Others think they are chemically distinct from the surrounding mantle, perhaps relics of an ancient differentiation event that happened early in Earth's history, possibly even fragments of a Mars-sized impactor that may have struck the proto-Earth and contributed to the formation of the Moon. Others suggest they are accumulations of denser, ancient rock that has settled to the bottom of the mantle over billions of years. There are arguments for each of these interpretations, and the truth is probably some combination of all of them. We do not yet know the deepest, oldest, most foundational structures inside our own planet, and we are still arguing about what they are made of and where they came from. And here is the part that connects directly to our story, the part that should make the back of your neck prickle just a little. Many of the major mantle plumes on Earth, including the Hawaiian plume that has been fountaining lava out of Kīlauea for the last 17 months, appear to rise from the edges of these LLSVPs. The plumes seem to originate, or at least seem to be modulated by, the boundaries of these enormous, mysterious deep mantle features. Hawaii, Iceland, Réunion, and several other hotspots all trace back, in the seismic imagery, to the margins of one or the other of the two LLSVPs. They are, in a real sense, children of the blobs. This raises a possibility that I find genuinely tantalizing, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. If mantle plumes share their roots in the same deep structures, could there be some shared dynamics that affect their behaviour? Could activity in one part of an LLSVP create pressure waves, or thermal pulses or compositional shifts that propagate through the structure itself to other plumes rooted in the same place? Could the two American plumes, Hawaii and Yellowstone, share enough of a deep mantle context that there is some weak, hidden link between them, mediated by these enormous deep structures we're only just beginning to understand? Is there, in some attenuated, complicated, hard-to-detect sense, a connection between distant hotspots that originate from a common deep source? The honest answer, and I want to be very clear about this because I do not want to overstate the case, is that we do not have direct evidence for this kind of coupling. The timescales involved in mantle dynamics are usually millions of years. Heat takes a very long time to move through solid rock, even rock that is plastic and slowly flowing under enormous pressure. Pressure waves propagating through the lowermost mantle would take days, weeks, or longer to traverse the kinds of distances we're talking about, and they would dissipate enormously along the way. The kind of coordinated week-to-week behaviour that would actually link the distinct surface events at Hawaii and Yellowstone in real time is not something that the standard models of mantle dynamics predict. The dynamics are too slow, the damping is too strong, the geometry does not support that kind of fast coupling. But, and this is the important caveat, our models of deep mantle behaviour are still incomplete. They are good, they have made real progress over the last few decades, but they are not perfect. And we know they are not perfect. We are still arguing about basic things at the most fundamental level. How do plumes actually form in the first place? Do they rise from a thermal boundary layer, or are they driven by chemical heterogeneities, or both? How do they maintain their coherence over millions of years of rising through a convecting mantle? What determines how long they last? Why some die out and others persist for 100 million years or more? Why do some plumes appear to wobble in their position over time, while others seem to stay anchored? These are not questions that have settled answers. These are questions that are still being actively debated in the geophysics literature, with new papers coming out every year that revise or challenge the previous consensus. So the possibility that there are connections we have not yet identified cannot be entirely ruled out. It just is not currently supported by direct evidence. We are in a state where we know enough to say that fast coupling between distant hotspots is unlikely under our current understanding, but where we also know that our current understanding has significant gaps, and surprises have come out of those gaps before. The recent finding that the Yellowstone deep source is offset from the surface caldera was itself a surprise. It revised an assumption that had been baked into the literature for decades. There may be more such revisions ahead. There almost certainly are. This loops back, again, to the central tension of the entire story. The unanswered deep Earth questions are not just academic curiosities. They affect how confident we can be in our predictions about systems like Yellowstone and Hawaii. The more we admit we do not fully understand the deep mantle, the less confident we should be in any sweeping claims about what is or is not connected to what. The internet wants the simple, dramatic answer. The mainstream often wants the simple, reassuring answer. Reality as usual sits in the difficult middle. Skepticism cuts both ways. This is the part I really want to land. We should not be skeptical only of the fringe theories. We should also be appropriately skeptical of the mainstream confidence that everything is independent, unrelated, and well understood. Both extremes are forms of intellectual laziness. The honest position, the one supported by the actual state of the science, is that we are still learning. We are still being surprised. We are still finding structures inside our own planet that we did not previously know existed. And until we have a much more complete map of the deep Earth, the only responsible answer to the question of whether these systems are connected is the answer scientists hate to give but should give anyway. We do not yet know. Part 19. The real pattern beneath the noise. Let me reframe everything we have been doing for the last hour or so, because I want to make sure the structure is clear before we land this. We have covered a lot of ground. We have gone from the summit of a Hawaiian volcano to the floor of a Wyoming forest. We have descended through tectonic plates, through the upper mantle into the lower mantle, all the way to structures sitting just above the molten outer core. We have touched on solar cycles, on conspiracy theories, on the strange psychology of pattern recognition, and on the quiet escalation of a thermal pool that almost no one had ever heard of 2 years ago. Before we close, I want to pull all of that together and make sure the shape of the argument is clean. Because if you walk away from this video remembering only one thing, I want it to be the right thing. Coincidence is the simultaneous occurrence of two events without a causal link. Causation is when one event actually produces another. These are different categories of relationship, and confusing them is the source of most bad reasoning about events like the ones we have been discussing. Most of human reasoning, frankly, gets tripped up at exactly this distinction. We see two things happen close together in time. Our brains, which evolved to find connections in our environment, immediately try to link them. The link feels real. It feels obvious. It feels like the kind of insight that the people around us must be missing. But feeling is not evidence. The strength of a perceived connection in our minds tells us almost nothing about whether the connection actually exists in the world. The fountain at Kīlauea on May 5th, 2026, and the explosions at Black Diamond Pool a week earlier are coincidental in time, in the strict sense that they happened in roughly the same news cycle. That is the only sense in which they are connected. They are not causally linked. No reasonable model of Earth dynamics can produce a mechanism by which one of these events caused or was caused by the other. The systems are too far apart. The plumbing is too disconnected. The energies do not transfer in any plausible way from one to the other on the timescales we are dealing with. If a meteor had struck the Atlantic Ocean during the same week, you could call that coincidental too. If a volcano in Indonesia had erupted on the same day as episode 46, that would also be coincidental. The world is full of large, energetic events that happen close together in time, without any of them causing any of the others. The week of May 5th, 2026 was just one example among many, but here is the more useful frame, and this is the one I want you to take with you. The Earth is a continuously active system. At any given moment, There are dozens of volcanic systems actively erupting somewhere on the planet. Stromboli in Italy, Sakurajima in Japan, Sangay in Ecuador, Reventador, Semeru, Erta Ale. The list is long, and most of these volcanoes never make the news outside their own regions. There are hundreds of active geothermal systems quietly bubbling, steaming, and occasionally exploding in the world's volcanic arcs and rift zones. There are thousands of small earthquakes per day, most of them too small to feel, registered only by the global seismic network and logged in databases that most people never look at. The Earth is never quiet. The Earth is never still. The Earth is at every moment a noisy, dynamic, energetic system, releasing energy through hundreds of channels at hundreds of locations all the time. So when we say that the Earth is unusually active in a given week, what we usually mean is that we noticed more events than usual, often because the events happened in places we pay attention to. The Earth itself was probably about as active as it always is. We just turned our heads, we just got a notification on our phones, we just opened a news app at the moment when an algorithm had decided that this particular cluster of events was worth showing us. The activity was not new, the attention was new, and once you grasp this distinction, you start to see how much of the global awakening narrative falls apart on its own. The Earth is not waking up. The Earth has always been awake. We just only notice it sometimes. So what we are observing during the first week of May 2026 is largely an artifact of attention. American hotspots got attention because they are American hotspots, because they have famous names, because the news covered them, because Hawaii has tourist webcams pointed at the lava, and Yellowstone has news bureaus that pick up every park advisory. Other simultaneous events around the planet, equally significant in their own geological contexts, did not get the same coverage. There were earthquakes in places that do not generate clicks. There were volcanic events in regions that do not have well-funded press offices. There were thermal anomalies in countries whose monitoring data does not flow easily into English-language news streams. All of those events were real. None of them got the same treatment as episode 46 or Black Diamond Pool. The pattern we see, in other words, is partly a pattern in the data itself and partly a pattern in our viewing. The signal we think we are detecting is mostly the shape of our own attention, reflected back at us. That said, and this is important, the comparison between Hawaii and Yellowstone is real. It is not a coincidence in the same way that the global cluster of seismic events is. It is two American mantle plumes, both producing surface expressions that we can study in detail, and the comparison between their behaviors is genuinely informative. We did not pick these two systems out of a hat. We picked them because they are both rooted in the same kind of deep earth phenomenon. They both originate as columns of rising hot rock from somewhere far below the crust. They both punch through tectonic plates from the bottom up. They both produce volcanism in places where conventional plate boundary theory says volcanism should not be happening at all. So when we compare them, we are not comparing apples and oranges. We are comparing two examples of the same rare geological category, and the differences between them are exactly the kind of thing that can teach us something useful. Hawaii is stable, predictable, episodic. Pressure builds, fountain happens, pressure drops, pause, repeat. The cadence has been remarkably consistent for over a year. The output is contained. The system is, by every available measure, doing what it is supposed to do. Yellowstone, at the level of Black Diamond Pool, is becoming less stable, less predictable, more dramatic in its individual events. The escalation curve has gone from 0 events in 152 years to 3 significant explosions in less than 2 years, with the most recent 2 happening within 24 hours of each other. The contrast is not noise, the contrast is signal. It is a real, meaningful difference between two systems that share the same deep origin, and that difference is telling us something, and the signal tells us something important. Mantle plume systems can produce wildly different surface behaviors depending on local conditions. The same kind of deep engine filtered through different crustal and hydrothermal systems can produce gentle fountains in one place and violent explosions in another. The deep engine, the plume itself, sets the budget. It determines how much heat is being delivered, how much magma is being produced, how much energy is available. But the surface expression, what we actually see and feel and have to live with, is shaped by the architecture above the engine. The crust, the plumbing, the aquifers, the faults, the chemistry of the local rock. All of these factors filter the deep signal in different ways, producing different outcomes from the same underlying process. The variability is not at the engine level, it is at the filter level, and that is precisely why the situation at Yellowstone is so unsettling, and why the situation at Hawaii is so reassuring. Both are mantle plumes, both share an origin in the same deep dynamics. But the surface filter at Yellowstone is doing something that the surface filter at Hawaii is not, and we do not fully understand why. This is the real pattern beneath the noise. Not that the Earth is waking up, not that the sun is causing eruptions, not that there is a secret synchronization beneath the global crust, coordinating distant hotspots through some hidden channel that no instrument has yet detected. The real pattern is something more local, more specific, and in some ways more disturbing. Two of the most important volcanic systems on this continent have very different surface filters, and one of those filters is currently doing something we cannot fully explain. The deep signals are quiet, the shallow behavior is changing. The mismatch between what we expect and what we observe is the actual mystery, and it sits not in the depths of the mantle, but in the tangled, hard-to-image plumbing of a single thermal pool in northwestern Wyoming. That is the story. That is the thing that should be on your mind when you walk away from this video. Not the dramatic music compilation, not the global awakening narrative, not the speculation about solar storms or hidden mantle connections. The thing to remember is the gap between what the model says should be happening and what the ground is actually doing. That gap is where the real questions live. That gap is what we are watching, and that gap is not closing, at least not yet. Part 20. The Unanswered Core Mystery. So we end where we started, at Black Diamond Pool, a small, deep, dark blue thermal pool inside Biscuit Basin, in a forest in northwestern Wyoming. A pool that for 152 years did absolutely nothing dramatic. A pool that, since 2024, has produced 3 major hydrothermal explosions, with the most recent 2 happening within 24 hours of each other, and with the second of those 2 larger than the first. We do not know why. We genuinely do not. Scientists have hypotheses. The plumbing model is the leading explanation. Slow silica deposition over many decades narrowed the conduits. Pressure built up over time. The seal failed in 2024, releasing some of the trapped pressure, but not all of it. A second seal failure produced the first explosion in late April 2026, and then the cleared pathway allowed a deeper reservoir of pressurized water to follow within hours, producing the larger second event. That hypothesis is consistent with the evidence we have, but there are other possibilities and the data is not yet rich enough to fully distinguish between them. What we do know is that the deep Yellowstone system is not the driver. The deep magma chamber is not pressurizing. The ground is not deforming in alarming ways. The seismic networks are not picking up anomalous patterns. So whatever is happening at Black Diamond Pool, it is happening shallow. It is happening in a tangled, poorly imaged region of the subsurface that we have very few tools to directly observe. This is the part that should stay with you. We have in the United States 2 of the most monitored volcanic systems on Earth. The seismometers, GPS networks, gas sensors, and satellite radar systems trained on Yellowstone and Kīlauea are world-class. We have been studying these systems for decades. We have written entire careers' worth of papers on them, and yet, when a single small thermal pool starts behaving in a way that does not match our models, we do not have a confident explanation for what is going on. That is humbling. Not in an abstract way, in a concrete way. It tells us that even our best understanding of the most studied geological systems on the planet has gaps in it, and those gaps are not at the boundaries of our knowledge, where we expect them. They are right in the middle, where we thought we had things figured out. The same humility applies to the broader question of mantle plumes. Hawaii and Yellowstone are 2 of the most extensively studied mantle plumes on Earth. We have been mapping them, modelling them, and writing about them for generations. And yet, the recent finding that the deep source of the Yellowstone plume is offset from the surface caldera tells us that even the basic geometry of these systems was not fully understood until very recently. If we got the geometry wrong, we may have gotten other things wrong too. The unknowns are still piling up, so pull the camera back one more time. The United States is the only country in the world with 2 confirmed mantle plumes operating beneath its sovereign territory. 2 rare, deep, ancient engines of geological activity, each capable of producing surface events that range from spectacular fountains of fire to violent explosions of superheated water. Each rooted in processes that originate possibly near the boundary between the molten core and the solid mantle, 1,800 miles below your feet. Each connected to a story that has been unfolding for tens of millions of years and will continue to unfold for tens of millions more. We watch them, we monitor them, we study them. And in the first week of May 2026, both of them produced significant surface events at almost the same moment. One did exactly what we expected. The other did something we cannot fully explain. And the gap between what we expect and what we observe is exactly where the real story lives. You and I live on the surface of a planet whose interior we have only begun to map. The continents we walk on are floating on a layer of slowly moving rock that we cannot directly see. The hotspots beneath them, the deepest expressions of that interior, occasionally reach up and remind us that they are there. They do not warn us, they do not coordinate with each other, they do not announce themselves, they just act. And when they do, all we can do is watch and try to understand and admit, when honesty demands it, that there are things happening beneath our feet that we have not yet learned to read. We are watching systems we do not fully understand. 2 of them, in fact, on the same piece of land, and they are not finished talking. The next time one of them speaks, the question will not be whether we hear it. The question will be whether, by then, we have figured out what it is actually saying.